Good evening. It's April 24th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're tuning in for our weekly broadcast on Friday nights here from LaRouchepack.com. I'm joined here in the studio by both Benjamin Deniston and Jason Ross from the LaRouche Pack Scientific Basement team, as well as Jeffrey Steinberg, who will also be participating in our discussion this evening as well. This broadcast is intended to serve as a sort of prelude of sorts to an event which is happening tomorrow, which is a live town hall meeting which will be simulcast from 3 locations, New York City, California, and Texas, and addressed by Keisha Rogers, Michael Steger, both members of the LaRouche Pack Policy Committee, as well as Ben Deniston. That event is at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 o'clock noon Pacific Time, and the invitation to this event was posted on this website and also sent out to you if you're on our email list, and we ask you to circulate that if you can. So as I said, our discussion here will serve as a prelude to that event tomorrow. Now, earlier today, we had a chance to speak with Mr. Larouche, and he emphasized that if you've been joining us over the last few weeks, you'll know that LaRouche Pack has set a new standard of leadership with the presentations that Ben Deniston has given, both on these broadcasts and also elsewhere. And our job here tonight is to draw out the implications of what Ben has presented from the standpoint of this question. What is the human species? What is our mission in the solar system? And what must be done to ensure that mankind fulfills this mission? Now, the problem that we face, and this is what Mr. Larouche emphasized earlier today, is that very few people in positions of leadership rise to that standard, the standard which was set by the presentation that Ben Deniston has given. You do have a very small but qualified number of leaders in areas of this planet, such as the government of China and related countries, such as the constituent countries among the BRICS, who do rise to that level of responsible leadership. However, here in the United States, we confront what you could call an epidemic of stupidity and pragmatism. And you have the press, the mass media, the members of Congress, elected officials generally, and the American public in general, who have no efficient understanding of the gravity and the profundity of the challenges which confront mankind. They have no real insight into reality, and they instead substitute a narrative which they wish to be overheard supporting and feel comfortable being overheard supporting, but which has no basis in provable scientific fact. They adopt slogans, they adopt positions on so-called political issues, some of which may even be the correct ones. But these opinions will tend to have no real merit, in fact, because they're not formed from the standpoint of scientific competence and scientific principle. So this is the significance of what you've heard presented by Ben Deniston over the past several weeks, which sets an entirely different standard. Now, as Mr. Larouche emphasized in our discussion with him earlier, what we need is an efficient apprehension of mankind's true role in the solar system and beyond, and the commitment to use every means available to mankind to fulfill that. Or said otherwise, we need people to begin acting like human beings and not just higher apes. We need to ask the question, what is the natural destiny of mankind? What is the current ability of man to achieve that destiny? What were the potential future ability of mankind to achieve that destiny were mankind to begin acting according to his true identity? And what is hindering mankind from attaining that future? And it's from this standpoint that you can confront the crisis that we face here at home as well as abroad. Yes, indeed, the United States has a crisis, a big one, typified by Barack Obama as you've heard, typified by Jerry Brown. But it is not only the United States. Mankind as a whole is in a crisis, which is caused by the way that mankind in general tends to think, and the way that governments tend to make policy based on their failure to take into account the identity and the true mission of mankind. This must be the starting point and not some afterthought. We have to begin from the standpoint of what the nature and the destiny of mankind must be, and then proceed from there, not the other way around. And as Mr. LaRouche also emphasized in our discussion today, the work that Ben Deniston has done achieves this standard and allows us to do just that. It allows us to at least begin to perceive that mankind has a future destiny which we have barely yet even begun to understand. And this is an insight which should define an entirely new view of mankind's view of mankind himself. So the responsibility of those who do have this quality of insight is to educate and to lead the rest of society and allow our fellow citizens to climb upwards to this level, to this view of the understanding of themselves, and make them more intelligent, as opposed to attempting to stoop down to their level for the sake of popularity, and in so doing, make yourself less intelligent. So Mr. LaRouche said, ask yourself this question: how many members of Congress understand this, the nature of the human being? How can they pretend to have the authority to legislate the affairs of mankind if they have no understanding of what mankind even is? So the problem that we face is the tendency by members of Congress and other elected officials, even the relatively better ones, to submit to stupidity and to compromise with incompetence. And this is what is killing us, literally. Just look at the current potential for widespread depopulation and drastic rises in the death rate caused by the water crisis now in California and in the western states. Look at the thousands of refugees who are drowning and dying in the Mediterranean, who are fleeing from the utter chaos which has been created as a direct consequence of Obama's illegal wars in Libya, against Syria, and the surrounding areas of North Africa. Look at the installation of an avowed Nazi government in Ukraine and the looming threat of a thermonuclear war between against Russia, but not only Russia, also not to mention China and elsewhere. These are the consequences of the willingness to accept the general stupidity of so-called politics today, and to compromise with both what the Obama administration and the Bush-dominated Republican Party represent. So we at LaRouche PAC fully intend to create a new presidency, but it must be created from this standpoint. What is the true mission of mankind? And what responsibility must our nation have to play its part in a positive way in allowing mankind to achieve that mission? And we intend to do this much in the way that Lyndon Larouche himself played a critical role in organizing the policy of the incoming presidency of Ronald Reagan in the years leading up to his election in 1980 around what became known as the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was an expression of the highest potentials of the human mind to harness the power of new physical principles in order to change mankind's view of himself as a species, change our relationship with the solar system, and in so doing, change the destiny of the human species itself, preventing the self-extermination of mankind through a holocaust of thermonuclear war. However, because of the poisonous influence of the Bush family inside the Reagan administration, that potential victory was sabotaged and derailed, and we now find ourselves on the verge of a war potentially far, far greater in magnitude and in destructive capability than what we faced even at the time of Reagan's presidency, which is a danger which I believe underscores the responsibility that we have here, even as a small handful of leaders in this country, all that much more. So what I'm going to do is ask Jeff Steinberg to come to the podium at this point and very briefly address those elements of the current situation. But this will be followed by the main feature of our broadcast here tonight, which will be a further elaboration by both Ben Deniston and Jason Ross on the implications of what they and their team have presented over the recent weeks on this program and elsewhere. So, Jeff?
Thank you, Matt. Over the course of the last week, we've had two very clear warnings, loud and clear warnings delivered over the immediate danger of thermonuclear war. During the weekend of April 18th and 19th, a gathering of defense officials from the better part of Eurasia, with the exception of Western Europe, except Greece, gathered in Moscow for the 4th International Moscow Security Conference. Now, a year ago, this same conference, the 3rd annual meeting, focused almost exclusively on the fact that there was a new form of asymmetric warfare that had just been carried out in the case of Ukraine and was directed in the very near future against Russia. This was the color revolutions. The conference in April of 2014 occurred just several months after the Maidan Square coup d'etat, neo-Nazi coup d'etat, that overthrew the legitimately elected government of Ukraine and set off the strategic crisis that has only grown in intensity since that point. This year's Moscow conference, one weekend ago, focused in a similar fashion on one overriding theme. And this year's theme was the fact that the world is closer to thermonuclear extinction than at any point in modern times, at any point in history. You had the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu. You had the Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, General Gerasimov, giving the two primary presentations, joined by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, and they all made the same point. The policies of President Obama, which have now been further extended to and adopted by NATO, are driving the world towards thermonuclear confrontation. The idea of deploying an anti-ballistic missile system into Eastern Europe, literally onto the coast of the Black Sea, in Romania, in other places in Eastern Europe like Poland, the forward deployment of advanced NATO equipment into the Baltic states, represents a provocation and preparation for an offensive nuclear first strike by NATO and the United States. And as the result of that, Russia has invested heavily in preparing to defend against such a strike, meaning that the world is on the verge of thermonuclear extinction. Now, this is something that is not the exclusive domain of Russia. I should say that the defense ministers of China, of India, of Belarus, of Kazakhstan, of all of the BRICS countries, with the exception of Brazil, Greece, the defense minister, Kamenos, was there, Indonesia, other countries in Asia were widely represented. So this was a gathering of countries that are all within the target domain of this U.S. NATO policy. This same danger is clearly recognized in the United States and was most clearly reflected this past Sunday, April 19th, as the Moscow conference was concluding, when an op-ed was published in the New York Times by General James Cartwright and General Vladimir Dvorkin. The article was headlined, "How to Avert a Nuclear War." General Cartwright was at one point the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, namely the thermonuclear force, the nuclear triad that would be used in carrying out such a strategic thermonuclear conflict. And General Dvorkin was the chief of intelligence of the Russian Strategic Nuclear Force. They came together and warned that the danger of nuclear war is greater now than at any point in history because, among other things, the United States and Russia are operating on a short time fuse launch on warning doctrine, and because since the Ukraine crisis, the entire apparatus that had been in place throughout the Cold War and well into the post-Cold War period of direct communications at the highest levels between the American and Russian militaries had been shut down, and therefore there are no fail-safe systems in place. And with a launch on warning policy, there is preciously little time, measured in minutes, not hours, for a decision to be made whether or not the orders will be given to launch a thermonuclear war that will wipe out humanity. Now, so on the one hand, Generals Cartwright and Dvorkin were absolutely correct in issuing this warning, and their prescription for how to deal with the crisis, although limited, would be necessarily part of any kind of solution. However, even these two very, very senior military officers, at least in this article, failed to identify why it is that this situation exists at this moment. And the simple fact of the matter, and Mr. LaRouche emphasized this point in a whole series of discussions over the course of the last week, is that so long as President Obama remains in office, he is the detonator for thermonuclear war. President Obama is a controlled asset, you could call him a patsy, of the London Wall Street financial oligarchy. That oligarchy is in a state of absolute desperation because their entire financial system is doomed and could blow up at any moment. And furthermore, they know that with the BRICS developments, the BRICS New Development Bank, the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and a whole array of other institutions that have already been set in motion, the seeds have been planted for an entirely new global system, a system that repudiates geopolitics and adopts a concept of the benefit of all nations working together for the advancement of mankind. This is the essence of what was launched last summer at the Fortaleza meeting of the BRICS countries, and all of these initiatives, with China playing an absolutely pivotal leading role, is exactly what the British and Wall Street fear the most. They fear the loss of their power, and they are prepared to go to any lengths. They are prepared to risk thermonuclear extinction in their desperation to retain power and defeat the moves towards this new paradigm of relations among nation states. Now, their desperation is understandable if one understands the history of oligarchy. The question that must be asked is, why is it that the American people remain tolerant? Why is it that the U.S. Congress remains tolerant of a president whose mere continuation in office can mean extinction for mankind as a whole? We have never been this close in modern history to a moment where it's possible for mankind to be eliminated through this folly. Yet Obama remains in office. The vast majority of people have their heads in the sand. And when it comes down to a question of, are you prepared to run the risk of the extermination of mankind in the greatest thermonuclear holocaust ever, the the conclusion must be that most people are distracted, are oblivious, and are unwilling to take the simple and necessary steps to make that happen. Now, I just want to briefly conclude with a note on the institutional question that came in for tonight's webcast and was presented to Mr. LaRouche, and he had some very precise and specific comments to make. The question was related to the assassin, the would-be assassin of President Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley. And the question was simply that Hinckley has been in a mental institution in Washington, D.C. Ever since his capture at the scene of the crime where he successfully shot President Reagan, attempted to kill him. Is it appropriate for Hinckley to be released from jail and basically released to the custody of his mother? Mr. LaRouche was actively involved with President Reagan. That collaboration began prior to President Reagan's election in 1980 and continued well into the Reagan presidency, particularly, as Matt noted, around the issue of the SDI. And Mr. LaRouche's answer was unequivocal. This guy is insane. He was a would-be presidential assassin. He should never be released to the general public because there is no reason to believe whatsoever that he is cured and that this same thing might not happen again. Furthermore, there are some very deep issues that remain unresolved about the attempt to kill Reagan. There have been very, very few genuinely great American presidents since the beginning of our republic. Washington, John Quincy Adams, perhaps, certainly Lincoln, certainly Franklin Roosevelt. We don't know the full story on John Kennedy because he was assassinated. So Lincoln was assassinated, Kennedy was assassinated, McKinley was assassinated, and that unleashed the horrors of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt came in. And yes, there was an attempt to assassinate Reagan. It came very, very close to succeeding, and in fact, it had the effect of tremendously weakening the Reagan presidency. What set up Ronald Reagan for the assassination was the fact that he was prevailed upon to select George H.W. Bush as his vice presidential running mate. And once that die was cast, Reagan was as good as in the crosshairs of Hinckley or whatever other assassin was going to be sent against him. And so there are many crucial questions. There was evidence at the time that Hinckley was being subjected to brainwashing modification based on a clear profile of a mental illness that he had that included a predilection for high suggestibility and for violent action. So there's no reason to believe that he's been cured, and because Mr. LaRouche had a deep personal involvement with the Reagan presidency, both before his inauguration, before the assassination attempt, and afterwards, we have a very special and personal view on this issue. So Hinckley should not be released, but more to the point, it's critical to understand that it's this British oligarchy that will resort to murdering American presidents when they feel threatened by the emergence of a president who may be genuinely independent and have certain leadership qualities. Reagan came into office with that potential. He was persuaded to bring Bush in, which set himself up effectively for the assassination attempt, and his presidency was greatly weakened both by the presence of Bush and, of course, in the aftermath of the Hinckley shooting.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Now, as I said in the introduction to this webcast, I'm joined here in the studio tonight by both Ben Deniston and Jason Ross. And based off of the discussion that we had with Mr. LaRouche earlier, what his what his directive was is that we continue the direction of presentations that we have had over the preceding weeks and draw out the even deeper implications of what you've seen presented by Ben Deniston in this venue over the last several Fridays. So I'd like to introduce Ben Deniston first, who will be followed by Jason Ross.
Thank you, Matthew. So as you just said, to continue the discussion that we've initiated, really the campaign on this water issue, Mr. LaRouche wanted this raised again tonight, but then brought to a new level, a new perspective on what we're dealing with when we're talking about the water crisis. And as we've covered, as we've discussed, there is a crisis. There's a crisis in California. There's a crisis in other western states in the United States. There are water crises in many nations and many regions around the world. But to get into this, I think it's important to state outright that there's a water crisis and there isn't a water crisis. We have immediate situations where people are threatened, populations are threatened, food supplies are threatened with a lack of water immediately. And this is perhaps most stark in the United States and California, as we've discussed. But there is a deeper issue which we want to get into. This is that fact that we have a lack of water in this location or that location isn't necessarily really a water crisis per se. It's a cultural crisis. It's a crisis, as Mr. LaRouche was saying earlier today, with the lack of understanding of leading policymakers with the very nature of mankind, what it means to be human. As Matthew referenced, Mr. LaRouche was saying earlier today, we have legislators who legislate for a species that they don't really understand. And perhaps typical leading this type of idiocy is Jerry Brown. And, he said this in his own words. I think it's worth just, he makes it useful because you can just quote him, so you don't have to do too much work. You just repeat what the guy said and you get a clear expression of the problem. But, when push came to shove on this water issue, and there he is as the responsible governor for the state facing an imminent crisis for a lack of water. His reply is that, well, the state really only used to have 300,000 to 400,000 people anyways. Now we have almost 40 million. So, we're way beyond the capacity of the state. I mean, this is the most idiotic thing. You could say that about any part of the entire world. You could say that about Europe. You go to Europe, a couple hundred years ago, it had a much lower population. It had a lower carrying capacity. You could support fewer people in Europe on the same European territory 300-400 years ago. The whole world used to only be able to support, a few million people. You go back a few 100,000 years. So yeah, that's a true statement. There used to be 300,000 or 400,000 people in California, but you could say that about any part of the world. What you see in such statements is a profound lack of understanding of the fundamental nature of mankind. There's no fixed carrying capacity for mankind. Yeah, there used to be 300,000 people. Mankind changed his relationship to the environment. Mankind progressed. Mankind increased the potential relative population density mankind was able to wield and affect. And we created out of a desert the most productive state in the entire country. That's typical of what mankind does as real human nature. So to cite the idea that the carrying capacity of the state used to be a small fraction of what it is now, and that somehow we should base our policy off of that is utterly insane. It's a lack of understanding, again, of the fundamental nature of the human species, of mankind. So, just to use that as a typical expression of the failed level of thinking that we're dealing with, what Mr. LaRouche said we want to get at today is how do we approach this as humans rather than animals. Jerry Brown defined the animal approach, right? That's his policy. Depopulate, go back to a level where you only have, a fraction of the population now, because he's no understanding of the true nature of mankind and human progress. But how do we address this as really humans, as human beings? How do we, as a unique species on this planet, fundamentally different from animals, how do we approach the situation around water, the water crisis? Just to continue the discussion from the past weeks, you take a first look. You're dealing with water. What do you see? We see we have a global system. First, it's not a finite supply. We're not using up water supplies. You have a cyclical system going on that involves the whole planet. And what mankind's been able to do is manage those cycles, manage those systems to make them more productive, to allow mankind to support more life, to expand populations, develop deserts, develop arid regions, develop agriculture. And mankind has managed not drawing down some finite supply the way people talk about it today, but we've managed these cycles, these systems of water on the planet to our needs, to ensure that we make the system able to support higher living standards, a growing population. That's characteristically human. That's what makes us human. There's no limit to our ability to do those types of things. So we're dealing with a single global water system, but as we've been discussing on these shows, as we've presented, we're now at the point where we're looking at this more closely. We're reapproaching this thing we call the global water system. And we're realizing it's not really a global system. We're looking at a manifestation on the planet Earth. But what's being manifested is not fundamentally a phenomenon of the planet Earth itself. The global water system itself, as we've discussed, is an expression of cosmic principles, cosmic influences. It's an expression of the activity of the solar system as a whole. The sun is driving the entire process. The entire water system as we know it is powered and driven by the activity of the sun, nothing on Earth. So you're immediately dealing with the expression of something that is reflecting the process of the solar system as a whole. But what we're putting on the table, and what is really the challenge for those of us who choose to approach this crisis from the standpoint of being human rather than animals, is that we now have insights into a higher level understanding of this system. That's not even just the sun. It's not even just the solar system. But that the water cycle as we experience it, as we depend upon it, as we manage it, expresses the relationship between our solar system and the galaxy more generally. That one of the most important influences affecting how the water system operates, especially in the atmospheric aspects of the cycle, is the role of galactic cosmic radiation, galactic factors, constantly affecting and determining the conditions of this supposedly Earth-based cycle. So again, this is stuff that we've been covering over the past weeks, that what you see as the global water system, and what we think we're dealing with is really a phenomenon. As Mr. LaRouche was actually saying earlier this week, it's a phenomenon, but what are the principles? What's driving it? What are the causes? You see this expression, but now we're seeing that this expression itself is manifesting activity that's driven by these larger influences, by the activity of the sun, by the activity of the galaxy more generally, and the relationship of our solar system to the galaxy. So that's our starting point now. That's our minimum. That's our baseline for thinking about water, the water crisis. This completely changes how we understand the issue of mankind's relationship to the water cycle. And this is not just academic studies. This is not just saying, okay, so we observe that the galaxy has this influence, has this role, and then we just go back to doing what we were doing before. This is the basis for a completely new level of how mankind is able to act on Earth, managing the system, influenced and informed by this higher principled understanding of the water system as an expression of this solar galactic relationship. We've discussed these weather modification technologies. They're just the beginning phases of mankind being able to manage these atmospheric conditions, these conditions associated with the role of galactic activity on the water cycle, that we can actually tap into the activity of the cycle as a whole in a way that's informed by our understanding of the system being driven by these larger forces, by these galactic forces. So again, this is now the start, this is the baseline from which we begin to now reapproach this question from this point onward. That we recognize that what we're dealing with on Earth is not an Earth-based process. It's not defined by the Earth. It's not bounded to the Earth. It's an expression of these larger systems, these larger processes. And here we are now, uniquely, mankind, discovering this and defining this, and this gives us a completely new basis to act based on this higher principled knowledge of the system as a whole. And this is what I want to just emphasize here and transition to what Jason is going to go through on this issue, because this is what Mr. LaRouche was stressing earlier today, is we have to now, we have to solve the water crisis. But the way we're going to do that is understand that crisis and the solutions as being expressed, encapsulated in this more fundamental issue of recognizing mankind as a fundamental force, not just on Earth, not an animal species on Earth, but a unique creative force that can understand the solar system, the principles governing the solar system as a whole, that can begin to understand the principles governing this system of our galaxy and the relationship of our solar system to our galaxy. And it's that knowledge, that new level of understanding that is uniquely human that we can develop, which gives us the ability to act differently, to create new actions on Earth informed by this higher creative understanding, which will allow us to address the water issues in a completely new way. So it's this unique perspective we have now of being able to conceptualize the principles governing this relationship between our Earth to the solar system to the galaxy, and then use that understanding, the science of that understanding, to change how we act, to inform how we act, to allow us to act in a completely new way on Earth. That is human. That's uniquely human creative action, something Jerry Brown does not understand. And Mr. LaRouche was saying earlier today, the problem is we're filled with supposed leaders of society who don't understand this fundamental issue. So this is now the kind of the underlying factor that we have to draw out, that we have to discuss, that we have to put up front and center, which is the way we handle these issues. The water crisis being a leading issue is by a recognition of the unique capabilities of human creativity as expressed in this water crisis as a leading example. So to transition to Jason, I would just say, if you want water, if we're talking to California now, if you want your water, if the Southwest states want their water, you have to understand mankind's ability to change his relationship to the solar system, to the galaxy more broadly. And that takes us to an issue of human creativity, which I believe Jason is going to discuss for us today.
Thanks. It's an undeniable historical fact that the thinkers that created the Renaissance held the view that human beings are created in the image of God. We are creators, and we carry the nature of the universe, its actual substance, the most characteristic basis upon which it operates within us, although we are clearly mostly unaware of this, unaware both of the nature of the creative potentials within our own minds and of the nature of the universe itself. Think about something that you know. Have something in mind. We're used to the childlike question that comes up, why? Children ask, why? You tell them an answer, then they ask, why? You answer that question, it might be met with, why? They realize they can go on like this for quite some time. Ask another question. How? How do you know whatever it is that you know? How do new things, known as discoveries, how do they become known to humanity? What is that process like? What is it as an experience internally, and what does it say about the nature and the action of us as a species? This experience, the creative process, is the most universal and essential of human experiences. It is a sense of the highest kind of goodness and of love, as is expressed by Diotima in Plato's Symposium. So, what is it to create? And is it different than discovering? Creation, discovery. Take the field of music. I don't think many people would say that Beethoven discovered his Ninth Symphony, that he was excavating and then he found inside a rock, he cracked it in half and there was a score to the Ninth Symphony. Clearly not. There's a lot of music that's been written. There's a lot of ways of approaching things. We definitely create music. That's a human field. How about in what seems to be the different field of science? When a scientist discovers something about how the universe works, how nature works, have they created knowledge? Have they discovered knowledge that was already there in the universe around them? Is there a distinction? I think most people would believe that we discover things that already exist, that there are principles in nature, they cause things to operate and unfold the way that we do. We discover those things and now we know them. There's certainly something to that. However, as Cousin emphasized, and as Kepler understood in the way that he approached his discoveries, it's also an act of creation. Two aspects to that. One is the creation of a new idea in the formation of a hypothesis. This gets left out or underplayed in the typical science fair procedures that people follow in school, where they come up with problems and hypotheses and independent and dependent variables and results and conclusions. The most interesting aspect of that, the creation of a hypothesis, what happens when that hypothesis is of a sort that's never before been experienced? Take Kepler. Kepler was the first modern scientist. He was the first astrophysicist. He discovered how the planets moved, and he did it not by looking at movements, but by movers. He had a physical hypothesis. It wasn't entirely right. In fact, to modern ears and eyes, it seems like it's almost entirely wrong in the way that he explained how the sun caused the planets to move. But what he did was he took a physical approach. He created a hypothesis of how it was that the sun, like a magnet, could be the cause of the motions of the planets. He followed that idea through. It resulted in a kind of motion for which no mathematics existed at the time, and wasn't to exist for actually about 100 years, when Leibniz created the infinitesimal calculus, less than 100 years. He took that concept, that hypothesis that he had, and he had to create motions of the planets to see if that fitted. When he looked at the planets overall as a system, he had to create a hypothesis of the musicality of the planets, of their distances between each other, of their eccentricities, with the view of how would God have composed the solar system in order that we would have characteristics in it that correspond to musical ones from a human point of view. Kepler created. He discovered, he created. So let's look at some problems in this, and then we'll come back to examining what this says about us as a species. Let's take up one of the most ancient of problems. Take Lyndon Larouche's view of Euclid. Larouche describes his first experiences with Euclid in school as a young man, as a student, as being not of the most pleasant variety. He really hated what Euclid had done. And it wasn't because he really disliked school or learning in general, but think about what the problem with Euclid was. So Euclid wrote these books about the elements of geometry, in which he has 13 books worth of, starting from a few basic axioms of geometry, he derives a variety of properties of geometric constructions. Cutting angles in half, eventually he gets to the Platonic solids, the sum of the angles and polygons, things like that. Here's the trouble with it. One, and this was recognized by Riemann and Einstein, Euclid's space was flat, even though space didn't have to be flat. But that's not the most glaring error, although it's an easier one to understand. The other one is that Euclid presented knowledge as deduction. That from a basic set of axioms, and it's not that many, about a dozen, you could derive from them the knowledge of everything that there would be to know about geometry. Taking that as a model for knowledge more generally is poison. It's deadly. Because discovery doesn't come from deducing conclusions from assumptions that we already have. You don't get to the future from the past. You don't get to a new concept, a new scientific principle, by showing how it's consistent and follows from what you already knew. More on that in a moment. Take another example. Larouche has been emphatic about the destructive effects on science in the 20th century, especially the role played by Bertrand Russell in his promotion of an attempt by David Hilbert in the very early 1900s to do something that might seem so abstract or academic to be unimportant that its importance can be overlooked. Hilbert had proposed as a study to determine whether it was possible to turn mathematics into logic. Was it possible, arithmetic in particular, was it possible to derive all of the properties of arithmetic, adding and multiplying and subtracting and dividing, and a few other things? Was it possible to derive everything interesting about that from logic itself, from the deductive process? Bertrand Russell set off to do that. He wrote a book, The Principles of Mathematics, later written in Latin, the Principia Mathematica. The reference to Newton, I think, is clear there, where Russell attempted to redefine the way that logic worked, redefine the way that arithmetic worked, to make it possible to make mathematics a branch of logic. I think he thought he succeeded. Kurt Gödel, a couple of decades later, after Russell's first publication of this book, made a devastating proof. You may have heard of it. It's called Gödel's proof, in short. It has a longer, more technical title. Basically, what Gödel had shown was that in any sufficiently complex system, like the logic of arithmetic that Russell tried to create, it was always possible to cause that system to break apart, to make statements that were contradictory, or to make statements that were undecidable. That there was always more to discover than could ever be put in any system where all future knowledge can be derived from the past. He showed that even in arithmetic, which doesn't seem like a very big scope, this doesn't include the mysteries of life or how the brain works, this is just arithmetic, that even in that prescribed field, the attempt to say that there's no creativity and that knowledge can be derived from the past, from a few basic assumptions, that even there it failed. This proved, before it had really even been created, that artificial intelligence was a waste of time. I don't think everybody realizes that who's working on that field, however. So, with these examples and with the importance that LaRouche has ascribed to them, with the problem of Euclid, which was overcome by Riemann, with the problem of Russell and how Gödel fought against him, and to give one more example, the problems left by Kepler about how change itself could be part of the language of science. This was resolved by Leibniz when he created his infinitesimal calculus. For the first time, it was possible, instead of things themselves, or relations among objects, stuff, instead of that being what was real, Leibniz allowed the way that those things changed to itself have a real existence. And he developed a language that let that be discussed directly. That was an amazing improvement. What Bernard Riemann did in creating an anti-Euclidean geometry was, in addition to showing that space didn't have to be flat, that there are a lot of three-dimensional manifolds that aren't necessarily flat, like Euclid's space, such as later Einstein's general relativity and curved space-time, Riemann also said, look, the basis of our understanding of this, the basis for understanding the shape of space, isn't in geometry. It's in those physical principles that we discover that govern how things take place in it. So with these things, we've got a couple of ideas floating around now. One, the actual existence of change itself as a concept. And two, the fact that the development of knowledge is nothing in common with logic, with deduction, with anything a computer can do. If you're a very logical person, you're never going to make a scientific discovery because the universe is illogical. It's not random and unreasonable, but it is absolutely and fundamentally illogical. So, how does that occur? We've discussed before, I'll be brief with it, an example that Vernadsky gave in a 1930 paper, where he talked about how, thanks to the work of Planck and Einstein, the language of physics had dramatically changed over the preceding 3 decades. He gave the examples of the concepts of space, time, of energy, and matter, which were totally different in his day than in 1900. Space and time used to be separate. According to Newton, they were independent things. They had no particular characteristics. Space was just a sort of galactic coordinate system in which different things would exist. Time just flowed on its own, nothing special about it. Einstein showed that there was only action in space-time combined, that space had a shape to it, that time could vary in its duration based on the motion of different observers watching a process unfold, and that even the concept of now, of simultaneity, would be different for different observers. Totally blew apart those very basic concepts of space and time, which seemingly had been around for centuries. The other two, energy and matter. Einstein showed that energy could become matter and vice versa. This is what happens in nuclear processes. Planck showed that energy came in pieces, like the matter of atoms. So those examples show how, just at the beginning of the last century, the very basic language, the basic concepts used to even discuss the universe, all changed fundamentally, and not by additions, not by deriving something new to add to them, but by fundamentally replacing, overthrowing, invalidating the old concepts. Discoveries aren't additions. They always overthrow something that's wrong because they're arrived at by a contradiction. The other aspect of this, what does it mean about us as a species that we do this? How do we change the universe? How do we understand it? First off, let's think about thought as a physical force. There's a lot of physical forces that are commonly considered. Gravity, people think about that. Friction, magnetism, electricity flow, Ohm's law, springs, the way, all these kinds of things. We understand these in a way that's different than the animals. Take a dog. Now, dogs try to understand things around them, and there's some things they can understand. They figure things out about the world around them. They try to train people in ways that they're susceptible of being trained. We do something different, right? Our thoughts create things that have never existed before. That thought's acting as a force of nature. To use a couple of examples from Vernadsky, or at least one, aluminum. Aluminum exists, pure aluminum, native aluminum, aluminum all by itself, not as a compound, exists nowhere in the Earth's crust. Well, now it does. It didn't exist before people. We create something that never existed before on this planet. Nuclear fission. Although the principles upon which it's based predated, the 20th century, the process of fission that takes place in a nuclear power plant doesn't occur anywhere on Earth, except perhaps one unusual place in Africa. But overall, it's a process that really just doesn't occur. The kind of fusion that we're working on creating in our laboratories, although it's based on what we believe to be taking place in stars and other things, the way that we would be creating it, something that's never happened before. Coal burning and producing motion, that doesn't happen without people. So, thought is a power in the universe. If it wasn't, then the universe would be fundamentally unreasonable. It wouldn't work internally as something that does let us understand things about that world. And it wouldn't work externally, letting us transform ourselves as a species, increasing our, what you might call, carrying capacity, as Ben had referenced, that we have transformed the potential population of our species. Animals haven't done that. They won't do it. They don't, unless their creative life be somewhere else in the universe. So, in this way, we are like the universe itself. The universe develops. Look at the development of life over evolutionary time on our planet. Look at the new technologies, you might call it, that have been introduced. Look at the development of galaxies over time. And then think about people who are worried about entropy and the heat death of the universe, and you can discard that as a concept. The universe develops. And consider this. Our discoveries, those principles that we've discovered, they're never actually completely right. None of them is so right that it won't, in the future, have the potential of being replaced by a discovery that supersedes it, as Vernadsky's reference to the early 20th century had done, where everything was overthrown. All of the laws of physics were overthrown. I think basically every one of them was replaced. So, the fact that the universe develops, that it responds to our developing discoveries about it, and our ability to create new things in the universe that would not exist without us, I think bridge the gap between the notions of creativity and discovery. We are creators. That image from the Renaissance that was absolutely a living image in the minds of those who created it, that human beings are made in the image of God. Think about that in modern terms. So let's talk about then what that world's like, that universe out there. How do we get there? How do we make discoveries about it? Because I think I've said briefly, new insights into it always come from contradictions in our current understanding, overthrowing our old thoughts by developing a new and necessary idea. When we do that, think about the experience of time when that's done. If you think about a timeline, as you might imagine it in a history book or, looking at geological ages, time moves along, moves from the past to the present and into the future. The thing is, when you introduce something that's new, the development of steam power, if you said humanity was on a timeline, well, was that an inevitable discovery? When that occurred, is that just the past going into the future? Or is that willful creation of something that had never existed before actually changing time, changing where we would be going, acting on that process of moving into the future itself? I think it is. And I think that that experience, the experience of the discovery, the experience of the creative process in science or in developing a greater insight into music, poetry, etc., that in doing that, we get to experience that reality that lies outside of time. You know, Mr. LaRouche has referred to a simultaneity of eternity, as seen in Raphael's School of Athens painting, where thinkers from different periods in history are all together. When you act on the trajectory of our species, and therefore the trajectory of the development of the universe itself, yes, it happens at a time, you might say, but the experience isn't one of being in time. It's being in eternity. The greatest duty or mission or opportunity of society, of government, is to provide the greatest and increasing number of its people the opportunity to participate in a process that really is immortal, that goes beyond your lifetime, not only in the sense of being remembered, leaving an impact that can't be effaced, but in changing what that idea of the future even could be. That's been something that not that many people over history have been actively engaged in, and which, at an increased rate in a society that understands that as the nature of human beings, will be able to progress in ways that would seem unbelievable to us today. It would certainly be one where going to space wouldn't be a difficulty, where controlling asteroids or comets that might destroy our planet, or at least life on it, wouldn't be out of the question, where we'd have fusion power for power here on Earth, for transportation and for energy source, for controlling the solar system, actions in it. It certainly wouldn't be one where we would worry about whether the sun happened to evaporate water, which we were then fortunate enough to have land in a place where we would want it. We don't do that with food presently. If there's no food in a farmer's field, he doesn't say, oh, there's a food crisis. His neighbor might say, well, you forgot to plant during the planting season. That's why there's no crops there now, right? With water, we can control the water cycles. This is something that's absolutely within our grasp. If the universe can do it, we can discover how it does, and we can do it ourselves. Even on a very, very practical level, maybe this might bring it down a notch, but even the amount of money that California was ripped off by the whole Enron fiasco around the year 2000, that would be enough money to build desalination plants for all the metropolitan coastal areas of the state for 25 million people. The amount of money that was stolen during the Enron fiasco. So the kind of humanity that we need to create, the idea of culture that we ought to strive for and develop and exist in and live as, is one where these problems are, they're surmountable. These aren't things that we can't deal with. And we'll be able to engage ourselves in more interesting problems. How does the sun work? Well, how is this galaxy developing the way that it is? You know, fun things. You know, new music. Fun and exciting things. We won't have to worry about things like, why is the governor of California such an idiot?
Thank you very much. On that note, I'm going to bring a conclusion to our broadcast here tonight. Let me just emphasize again, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 o'clock noon Pacific Time, we will be broadcasting a simulcast on this same website, LaRouchepack.com, of a joint town hall meeting which will be occurring between Texas, California, and New York City. So we ask you to join us again tomorrow at that time. It'll be broadcast live on LaRouchepack.com. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Jason, Ben, and Jeff very much for joining me in the studio. And please stay tuned to LaRouchepack.com.